I'm Jan Ashravinsky. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. For the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Central Asia's 5 states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, found themselves without territorial disputes or open political grievances towards one another. After decades of clashes, distrust and periodic bloodshed in the Ferghana Valley, the leaders of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan gathered in Kyrgyzstan this spring to formally declare an end to their long-standing border conflicts. It is a turning point few would have imagined even a decade ago. But this new stability is not simply the product of diplomatic goodwill. It is emerging from a transformed regional landscape shaped by shifting power balances, economic realignments, the consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine, and many others. There is a growing recognition in Central Asian capitals that cooperation offers more security and more opportunity than confrontation. Without further ado, let's take a look at the state of Central Asia in 2025 in our next feature.
As the world seems to be heading towards a new age of empires, Central Asia's 5 nations are becoming increasingly active on the world stage. What started as deep territorial cooperation has now expanded beyond the region's borders.
The borders between individual countries were closed. There was no trade, no transit, no business, no humanitarian exchanges. Relations were simply frozen. No one could have imagined then that in the very near future we would stand together to represent the region in negotiations with European leaders.
Frankly, none of these Central Asian countries will become world powers. They do not have the populations or diplomatic influence to achieve such status, but they can become middle powers. So what that means is, they are still players who can define world politics in many ways, but are mostly focused on regional affairs. Kazakhstan, the largest Central Asian nation, can be considered a middle power due to its strong economy, financial stability, and balanced diplomacy that stretches between Europe, Russia and China. It often hosts international forums and has been crucial as a waypoint between East and West.
Central Asia is turning into a key logistics hub, connecting the largest regions of Asia and Europe.
Uzbekistan is often seen as an emerging middle power whose position is driven by recent reforms and strong economic growth. It is, however, very heavily reliant on foreign financing, and while its diplomacy has shown itself to be versatile, it does not have the level of prestige that Kazakhstan enjoys. Turkmenistan is home to significant supplies of natural resources, but it cannot be considered a middle power due to its highly limited economic and political diversification. Its global influence is also heavily constrained compared to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan remain the furthest away from achieving a middle power status. They are economically weaker than their regional partners and are still quite heavily reliant on outside support. It wasn't until recently that they were able to soften tensions and conflicts between each other.
And now we're zoning in on the east-plaining portion of our show. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have perhaps been the most volatile of the Central Asian 5 when it comes to regional relations. However, 2025 saw a huge breakthrough between them as the two countries struck a landmark border deal.
This year, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan signed a crucial agreement to finally demarcate and manage their shared border. This is widely seen as a huge step forward from years of instability in Central Asia. The two countries have long struggled with territorial disputes along parts of their poorly defined border, with the Ferghana Valley experiencing the worst of it. These disagreements often led to armed clashes, leaving dozens dead and forcing thousands of others to flee their homes. Yet analysts say that the new deal shows a pivot towards diplomacy after years of failed negotiations. As part of the agreement, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have committed to formally demarcating contested areas, exchanging certain swaths of land, and introducing joint border control mechanisms. Domestic pressures appear to have played a key role in pushing both sides towards the compromise. Economic hurdles and general public fatigue with violence created the necessary impetus for reaching a settlement. Other powers, including Russia and China, and and regional organizations were involved in the negotiation, but without influencing the outcome. Instead, the peace process was pushed forward by bilateral talks and a growing exhaustion with constant tensions. What is more, the agreement also emphasizes cooperation at a local level between the two nations. Border communities have to be involved to prevent future flare-ups and ensure that the deal translates into lasting peace. Observers say that the deal might become a blueprint for resolving other conflicts in the post-Soviet sphere, as it has demonstrated that such disputes can be addressed through diplomacy rather than force.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail, so let's begin. For over 3 decades, the Ferghana Valley has symbolized the limits of post-Soviet state building. Split between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, it has witnessed repeated bouts of violence, militarized standoffs and constant disputes over land, water and infrastructure. Hundreds have been killed, thousands displaced, and entire communities have been kept on edge by a conflict that outlived multiple political transitions. What changed on the 31st of March in Kyrgyzstan was not merely a declaration, but a recognition by regional leaders that the cost of confrontation has finally exceeded its political value. Soviet-era borders drawn in the 1950s without regard to demography, agriculture or geography left a legacy of overlapping claims. Now, during the Soviet period, these administrative boundaries mattered little. After 1991, they became markers of sovereignty. Each new state interpreted old Soviet cartography to its own advantage, setting the stage for decades of disputes. Each government insisted that its interpretation of the border was the correct one. Uzbekistan's early posture under Islam Karimov was especially rigid. Tashkent unilaterally demarcated sections of the border, installed barbed wire, erected checkpoints, and even mined certain areas after a militant incursion in 1999. The message was unmistakable. Compromise was off the table. Meanwhile, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan maintained their own competing territorial claims, escalating tensions around enclaves, mountain passes, and critical water infrastructure. The breakthrough came only after 2016, when Shavkat Mirziyoyev reshaped Uzbekistan's foreign policy. By shifting away from isolation toward regional engagement, Tashkent helped resolve all outstanding Uzbek border disputes by the early 2020s. For governments focused on regime stability, sustained border conflict had become too risky to manage. Russia's declining regional influence further altered the equation. As both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Moscow had long been expected to mediate. But after launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Kremlin's bandwidth narrowed sharply. In a rare public admission, Vladimir Putin stated in late 2022 that Moscow had no intention of acting as a mediator. This vacuum elevated Uzbekistan's role, however. Since 2018, Tashkent has pursued a deliberate strategy of regional integration, reviving Central Asian summits without outside powers and positioning itself as a facilitator rather than a hegemon. By 2025, this approach bore fruit. Still, a regional shift is unmistakable. For the first time since independence, Central Asia's governments have neither open territorial disputes nor active political grievances against one another. The incentives for cooperation are strong and growing, though the recent stability is not guaranteed. But it reflects a moment in which cooperation brings tangible rewards, and conflict imposes unacceptable costs. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, board member at the Caspian Policy Center. Hello and welcome once again to TVP World.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's take a look at the events that people might have missed taking place in Central Asia this year, starting with elections in Kyrgyzstan. Now, to what extent do they really matter in the political system that is present in that country today?
I suppose it matters in so much as it kind of solidifies the president's power in the country. They went to a different system of electing deputies this time around, which was actually the old system, but they all did single mandate. So you could pick, I don't want to go into the details, but there was 3 candidates from 30 districts that got in. None of the candidates, because of the way they organized it, got more than 20,000 votes except for one, and that was the brother of the security service. So essentially what you ended up with was a bunch of local officials now, or parliamentary officials, that are pretty much beholden to the government, far more than half of the 90 people in parliament. It clears the way for the president of Kyrgyzstan to enact other, I hesitate to use the word reforms, but changes. I mean, among one of the changes that he wishes to make is to reinstate the death penalty, for example. But it certainly makes this a completely pliant parliament that's likely to do whatever the president says. And I should also mention on that note that it was not so high. I mean, it was less than 40%. So it kind of shows you that the political energy in Kyrgyzstan is waning lately. But we are looking at a fairly presidential system going forward for the next 5 years in Kyrgyzstan.
So Kyrgyzstan is not on a path towards any sort of significant change, but one could say that the entire region might be, because they are gaining in importance. They are, in a way, also gaining in terms of opportunities which are presenting themselves. Where would you say, lies the next major checkpoint, so to say, along that path for Central Asia? Is it perhaps greater cooperation, greater unity, one could say?
Yeah, well, if we're speaking regionally, then definitely. I mean, there was a huge event this last year. The 3 countries that share the Ferghana Valley, it's the most fertile region of Central Asia. It's also the scene of probably the oldest inhabited areas of Central Asia, going back thousands of years. And the way the borders were drawn during the Soviet times, they kind of go back and forth, in and out. And so at the time, you had 3 Soviet republics sharing the Fergana Valley, which is roughly the size of Honduras, I believe. But of course, now in the days of independence, you have 3 countries sharing these borders, and there have been a lot of tensions along these borders. We saw 2 brief wars between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan just a couple of years ago. Uzbekistan had landmines along its sections of the border in the Fergana Valley with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. But earlier this year, the 3 countries, after more than 30 years, finally decided on where all the borders are in their country along the Fergana Valley, and the 3 presidents met for the first time in the valley to sign the agreement that delimited the border, and they're in the process of demarcating it right now. So this is a huge relief, really, for the whole region. Because, like I said, this was a hotbed of tensions for quite a long time. There were a lot of times where the borders were closed there. It impeded trade, as you can imagine. So this was a huge move in the right direction.
And it's probably notable, if I may, it's probably notable that this was not achieved through the brokerage of any major power. I mean, Russia had once tried to do that, but it really didn't work. So later on, it was actually Uzbekistan that was able to achieve this result, was able to assume the role of the mediator for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So this actually gives a greater agency to the region itself, because they are not actually dependent on any major foreign power when it comes to this entire process, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. This was a big achievement, and there was a lot Russia did offer to mediate, but then again, as I mentioned, the problem is the borders that were drawn in Russia, almost 100 years ago. A lot of countries there didn't see. Kyrgyzstan had their view of whether Russia would be an honest broker. Tajikistan had its view of whether Russia would be an honest broker. Uzbekistan had its. Uzbekistan finally stepped up. It's kind of a natural role for Uzbekistan to play. Of the 3 countries that share the Fergana Valley, I mean, Uzbekistan's population is probably around 38 million right now, whereas Tajikistan's is about 11 million, and Kyrgyzstan's a little more than 7 million. So, really, Uzbekistan is kind of the big brother, might not be exactly the right word, but they're certainly the more powerful of the 3 countries that occupy the Fergana Valley. No one wanted to get involved in this conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, like you said. Russia made a kind of half-hearted offer there, but it was really ultimately going to be up to Uzbekistan to push its 2 neighbors to try to resolve this problem that they had after Uzbekistan had resolved its own border problems with both of them.
So it seems that Uzbekistan wants to follow up on that. There was quite recently a proposal for a new community of Central Asia. So essentially an area of, if not free trade, then at least, greater facilitation in terms of trade, in terms of mutual cooperation. So once again, the initiative of Shavkat Mirziyoyev. And apparently, Azerbaijan is going to be on board with that as well, not technically being part of Central Asia, but considered to be spiritually a part of the region. Do you think that it is likely to work? And is it likely to perhaps rub any sort of major regional power the wrong way? Any country that lies, close to Central Asia, which could take exception to this budding a new cooperation initiative?
Yes, this is one of the more interesting developments of the region, without a doubt. These countries that you mentioned, with the exception of Tajikistan, are also members of the Organization of Turkic States, or in Turkmenistan's case, at least an observer. Turkey is also involved in this too, although if we're just speaking about the 5 Central Asian countries and Azerbaijan at the moment. It's part of that process of greater cooperation between them. Now, they all stand to gain something from this because they're on part of the middle corridor, if you want to call it that, or the Trans-Caspian international trade route. It's the same thing. But they all stand to gain a lot for cooperation there because they are finally reclaiming a historic role as a major trade route in the world between East and West, in this case between China and the European Union. Although there's also branches that can go south into the Middle East and even over to India, they're hoping eventually. But so these are all things that are bringing these countries together, and they really need to coordinate their efforts simply to transit goods, right? But in the meantime, the cooperation has taken on a bunch of other aspects too. Security is a component in that, and they have held security or exercises in the Caspian region that involve Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. So the cooperation is a good thing for the region. It does build something of a new bloc is being formed out there. Now, your point about who would be objecting to this? Well, there's a couple things going on here. Certainly, Russia, under its divide and conquer policy, is unhappy to see the region cooperate. It was much better when they were arguing with each other, as they really did for most of their 34 years of independence, because then it was easy for Russia to send envoys to one country and say one thing to the leadership there, and then go to another country and kind of keep things on edge so that everyone had to look to Russia to be the ultimate mediator or arbiter of some of their problems out there. So the fact that they got this unification is definitely to the Kremlin's detriment. I would mention also that because the bulk of these countries are Turkic countries, right, with the exception of Tajikistan, which has Persian heritage, they all are Turkic heritage countries, and they can all trace their history back to common ancestry. Now, if you're in China and you're trying to keep control over the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the Uyghurs are also part of the Turkic nations that are from the Middle Steppe too. So if these countries west of the Chinese border are starting to cooperate much better and forming some kind of solid union or bloc that's actually going to be influential on the world stage, then you have to be concerned about your own Turkic population in Western China, the Uyghurs, and there are Kyrgyz and there are Kazakhs out there too. And what the future is, if this Turkic bloc that's being formed is successful, will it have any influence on the Turkic people inside China, who are being repressed right now by the Chinese government, and where will that go? Will they demand to be more part of the rekindle these desires for nationalist aspirations and separatism, and they want to be part of this Turkic bloc, and maybe things get worse, and the Chinese have to send in extra troops to keep things under control? I mean, there's a lot of possibilities.
Let's move on quickly to the summit in Japan. Well, some people could say that's an unexpected place for leaders of Central Asia to meet up. What was the agenda here, and what does this bring to the table?
Well, the first thing I think is really interesting about this is that Japan is the first one that ever organized a C5+1. Right? I mean, they had the foreign ministers C5+1 in 2004, and everyone picked up on this kind of format after that. So in a way, it's finally come home to Japan for a summit. I mean, they never had a summit of the leadership before, but they have had regular meetings of the foreign ministers for more than 20 years now. Japan has been, I used to call it like stealth diplomacy. Japan has been moving in Central Asia ever since they became independent. Japan has been there and done a bunch of projects which don't draw a lot of attention internationally. And the Japanese don't advertise it very much either, but they have been part of Central Asia development for quite a while. Some of the deals that we saw that were signed there, Sojit is a major engineering firm. It's been active in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan for some time. The Japanese companies are supplying parts to, the gas processing plants in Turkmenistan. Japanese companies are building, at least in the past, have built the roads in Kyrgyzstan, parts of Kazakhstan. They've helped out with railway. This one was more about the Central Asia's new need. In Central Asia's new need is AI at this point. So they have the resources there. Their industries are being built up, but what they really need is to be able to run these things efficiently. And so when the Central Asians make any trip somewhere, when they were in Washington last month, when they go to China, this is way up on the agenda. It's trying to figure out digitalization, artificial intelligence. How can they make this work? How can they integrate it with their own systems, their infrastructure, their industry to increase efficiency? And that was a big part of the C5+1 that we just saw in Japan. Japan, predictably, as everyone else has lately, wanted to talk about critical minerals that they have in Central Asia and the potential that Japan has for producing or at least extracting and exporting back to Japan some of these minerals. Again, Japan's well placed because they have been a solid partner in Central Asia for more than 30 years now. But at the end, of course, the numbers that were produced were pretty impressive. I mean, I've seen reports that said that there was deals signed worth $19 billion. And that's really the story of Central Asia since the C5 as leadership, as presidents have been traveling around. They met with the EU earlier this year. Of course, they met with China. They met in the United States, and they've been signing all kinds of deals that were worth billions of dollars all the time. Japan is the cherry on top of the cake at the very end of the year, where they went to an old partner that they've been dealing with for a long time. For the first time, the leaders all got together to meet, but they know each other very well. They've been dealing with each other for a long time, and they signed a bunch of deals which are beneficial to both sides. Central Asians got what they wanted from a reputable partner who, if anyone knows anything about AI and computerization, Japanese are certainly right up there. And the Japanese are getting the raw materials or hopefully processed materials that they need, remembering, of course, that Japan runs several nuclear reactors too, and they source some of their uranium from Kazakhstan, for example. So a good deal all the way around. And like I said, if you're a Central Asian leader, this is a fantastic way to end the year. What's been a very successful year in Central Asia.
Bruce Panea was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us, and as always, for sharing your insight.
No, thank you for having me.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.